The class action lawsuits against the UFC are officially dead in the water as they have reached a $335 million settlement to end both of those lawsuits, with the UFC avoiding trial. Today, I'm going to give you guys my thoughts on the settlements, the lawsuits, and give you my thoughts for what this means for the UFC going forward. Stick around for my thoughts. I'm Wyatt, and this is Fight Society. All right, guys, so a big update to the UFC antitrust class action lawsuits that I covered in my video just yesterday, where I discussed the UFC's efforts to bury any media surrounding the details of those cases and essentially wipe the history and facts about those cases. Now, I have a few articles pulled up here. The very first one says, this is from John S. Nash, says, "It's official, $335 million, tax deductible for the UFC. No mention of contract changes here." And the filing says, on March 13th, 2024, TKO reached an agreement to settle all claims asserted in both class action lawsuits for an aggregate amount of $335 million payable by the company and its subsidiaries in installments over an agreed upon period of time. The terms will be memorialized in a long form agreement and then submitted to the court for approval. The company anticipates that the settlement amount will be deductible for tax purposes. Now, this is something that I find really interesting off the bat, is that it's going to be tax deductible for the UFC, the same way that any sort of business expense or loss would be. Now, this is crazy because unfair business practices, this is what the lawsuit was supposed to assert, was unfair business practices were suppressing fighter pay and drowning out rival companies that could have been competition for the UFC, such as Strikeforce back in the day. You could also consider Pride part of that. Now, I have a few comments to this tweet pulled up right here that I found really interesting and that I agree with. So it basically was never, "Let's improve fighters' rights." It was, "Let's get an easy payday." And from the looks of it, they sued for way more than they settled for, $1.6 billion. And they settled for about 20% of that, for $335 million. Someone else says, "Garbage from the fighters, lost all respect for them. They really had a chance to change the game and decided to be selfish instead." This is really interesting because in my last video, I was saying how this entire lawsuit is an iceberg for the UFC, and $1.6 billion in payouts being made in court judgments could actually financially cripple the UFC for a substantial period of time. I'm going to look it up right here. The UFC's income for 2023. TKO says that the UFC has $1.3 billion of revenue that they contributed to TKO in 2023. This would mean that if this lawsuit went to trial and they had to pay this $1.6 billion judgment, it would have been like the UFC having no business and doing no events for over a year. And this is really interesting. I really think that the fighters here could have done a lot better in terms of changing the game. And that first contact and that first comment really shows, and I agree with, saying that this was more about a payday. This really wasn't about changing fighters' rights. And the UFC, they're going to maintain their vice grip hold on the MMA combat sports world. And you can even see here, the TKO group. Yeah, the TKO group has had its first significant bump in stock value because of this. And so the rich get richer, the UFC make a small payment that is tax deductible. Fighters are still going to be getting paid $12,000 and $12,000 for their contracts. Now that the UFC basically has no threat to their financial well-being or their place in the market at all, I don't really see there being any other threats going forward ever coming up. This is basically it. The UFC's not that old. And so all of their alleged mispractice was in this time period. It was from 2010 to 2017 in one of the lawsuits. And then the other lawsuit was from 2017 forward. And now that both of these have been settled, the UFC is going to have no challenges. I mean, especially with PFL and Bellator, they just put Bellator on HBO, and Bellator has been a failed brand on every platform. Showtime, Spike, everything that it's been on, Bellator has failed. And so PFL, with their leadership, just banking on Bellator's long-term existence and long-standing name in the MMA space as a reason to keep the brand alive, is pretty concerning. I think that this is poor judgment from the PFL, and it just shows the business acumen difference between the PFL heads and the people running the UFC. The people running the UFC are going to drown out the PFL the same way that they drowned out every other organization like Strikeforce and Pride. This was just a massive, massive victory for the UFC. I'm surprised. You know, the trial was supposed to start right after UFC 300. And if they had to pay this out, it could have been dark times for the UFC. And because these fighters wanted the quick payout, the UFC or the MMA landscape is going to stay the same for probably ever. It seems like there's no change in sight now. The fighters are still going to get $12,000 to show and $12,000 to win. There's going to be no health insurance. There's going to be no protection for the fighters. There's not going to be fair competition between all of these other companies. And the UFC, with this lawsuit being over with, has essentially just cemented themselves as the NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL of the MMA space. There will be no challengers. One championship. They have kind of shady financials. I think they've just been bleeding money for years. The PFL has yet to make $1 in profit yet. You could say that this is a good day for combat sports because the biggest company is going to continue to thrive without any major threats. But you could also say that it's a dark day for combat sports and for MMA because there will be no fairness amongst these other companies. The UFC will be the law of the land going forward. So let me know what you guys think. Do you think this is good for the sport, bad for the sport? I want to hear your thoughts. This was a major update, and I just gave you guys a video about the UFC covering this up yesterday, so I want to hear your thoughts. If you like this video and you want more content just like this, click that subscribe button down below. If you want more content from me, go check out my weekly comedy podcast, the Hissyfit podcast, and go check out my personal channel, Wyatt's World. Go watch this suggested video, and I'll see you next time.